Hi, everyone. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. I see that we have some participants that have joined. My name is Courtney Smith. I am a clinical psychologist here at the University of South Carolina. I'm part of the school behavioral health team, and I have a wonderful co-presenter that'll introduce herself.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lauren Simonik. I work with Children's Trust of South Carolina, coordinating our Strengthening Families program in the PD region, as well as supporting our ACEs initiative. I'm glad you all could be here with us today.
Awesome. So I just want to give a special thank you to the Behavioral Alliance of South Carolina, as well as the University of South Carolina Southeastern School Behavioral Health Community for making this happen. I'm really excited. This is a unique opportunity to reach such a vast crowd and such a diverse crowd as well, because I know we have folks from a lot of different backgrounds and professions. So I'm really excited about that. Just as a disclaimer, this might be a review for some folks. But I'm hoping that everyone can kind of take away something that they didn't know. And we are encouraging, so I'm not sure how familiar everyone is with Zoom, but there is an opportunity to be able to ask questions. So I believe at the top of your screen or somewhere on your screen there should be a chat, and so we're asking that everyone who has a question just type it into the chat box, and we'll do our best to answer those questions throughout. If we don't get to a question, then we'll definitely get to it at the end before we end. And we are working within about an hour, so we'll be wrapping up no later than 5 o'clock. This presentation usually is between about an hour and a half to even longer. So we're going to kind of keep it moving, but obviously if you have questions that come up, please let us know. We're excited. All right, I'm going to go ahead and turn off my video for now. And also if the blocks are kind of getting in your way or are annoying to you, you can also minimize those. All right. So the presentation today is, like I said a moment ago, an introduction to understanding adverse childhood experiences, or what you'll hear mostly from us referred to as ACEs. And so I'm not sure how many folks are familiar with ACEs, but we are going to kind of go over that and provide you with an overview. So when you're thinking about ACEs, you can almost think about an iceberg, right? So an iceberg, you have the top piece where, you see the little top piece, and you can, but you also know that there's that larger piece underneath. So that top piece, when thinking about ACEs, are the things like the behaviors that we see children display, or the conditions that children may have that they're dealing with. But what we don't often see is what's underneath the water surface and what is contributing to all of those behaviors and conditions that we see. So that's what we're going to focus on today. So to give you a little bit of background or context, in the early 90s, there was this critical study done called the ACE study, what we'll refer to as the ACE study anyway. And it was a collaboration between the CDC, or Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and Kaiser Permanente. And it was the largest study of its kind, involving over 17,000 participants, which is pretty impressive. And so what we found from that study was that adversity early in life leads to increased physical, mental, and behavioral problems later in life. And so before we go on any more about ACEs, I know that there are some folks that may have never heard of it, and so I just want to give a little bit of a background in what they are. So ACEs are traumatic events that occur early in a child's life. And so some examples of those would include abuse, neglect, household dysfunction, and homelessness. And you can see numbered there at the bottom are some impacts that ACEs have on children, but we're going to discuss others as we're moving forward. But this kind of helps to give you a general sense of what we're talking about when we use the term ACEs.
And so what we're going to do before we get into some of the ACE data and what the study told us, we're going to briefly go over our brain development. And that starts with our human nervous system. We all know that our nervous system connects our brain to our bodies. So it takes our brain and connects it through our spinal cord to these peripheral nerves, which are the nerves in our fingertips and our toes, and they take all the sensory that we are experiencing throughout the world, and they basically make sense of it, right? So when we touch things, we feel things, that's our nervous system working. And if I touch a hot stove, those peripheral nerves on my fingers are going to tell me that that's hot, and my body's going to withdraw automatically before I even think about that. And that's how my brain is wired, to be able to adapt to keep me alive. That's really the whole point of our nervous system, is to adapt in ways that keep us alive, and our brains are really good at that. What we're going to talk about is how these things called ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences, things like trauma or toxic stress, actually wire our bodies differently based on the way that our brain develops through this influence of toxic stress. And we're going to look at that through something called synaptic density. So we're looking at this image, and what I'd like you to remember as we're looking at this image is that this is something called normal growth. Okay, so if we are looking at this timeline, we see that at birth, there's a couple of these pieces of growth. And what we're actually looking at is our neurons, or a single nerve cell, connected to each other through our brain wiring. So we have all of these neural connections that is our brain growing. And at birth, we know that infants don't need a whole lot of that neural wiring because, well, they don't really need to do a lot at that point in time, right? They need to eat, sleep, cry when they need something, and poop. So they don't have all those neural connections that our brain needs later on in life. So this is at birth a normal growth of the synaptic density, or the density of brain development. Our neurons have different periods of growth and wiring that can be impacted at different stages of life. So then we go into this next stage of elementary age, and we see this blossom, or this bloom. This is actually what we call branching of synaptic density, because the brain is making all of these different connections based on experience. So our synaptic density, or our brain development, is experience dependent, meaning what we experience the most creates the strongest brain development or pathways. So here at elementary age, we all know the saying of children having brains like sponges, and this is a visual representation of that. Children's brains are growing based on all the experiences that they are having. So all of these robust connections between the nerve cells that are forming networks are based on having positive and negative experiences. This makes the case for having many positive experiences for children, like having conversations with not just their peers, but with adults, going on field trips in elementary school, having social connections, being able to problem solve. The more that they do those things, the stronger those neural connections are going to be in their brains. Now we can see the next stage in life of puberty. There's a lot less or fewer of those neural connections. And that's normal. Remember, we're looking at this normal growth, and it's normal because our brain wants to be as efficient as possible. So what it does not use, it's not going to keep around. So it actually prunes away the different neural connections that it uses the least. And this makes the case for how neglect and abuse really impact the way that our brains developed. Because if a child is neglected and they are not getting those experiences, they are not going to be keeping those strong neural pathways into puberty. They're actually going to be pruned away, much like we prune trees or shrubs. It also makes the case for how abuse, the more a child experiences that, the stronger those neural connections will be within their brain as well. So this shows normal growth. And what we have as we go through life is that based on our experiences, our brain will grow differently. And so we're going to watch this little clip, it's called Brain Builders, about how positive and negative experience can impact the way that our brain develops.
Science tells us that the experiences we have in the first years of our lives actually affect the physical architecture of the developing brain. This means that brains aren't just born, they're also built over time based on our experiences. Just as a house needs a sturdy foundation to support the walls and roof, a brain needs a good base to support all future development. Positive interactions between young children and their caregivers literally build the architecture of the developing brain. Building a sturdy foundation in the earliest years provides a good base for a lifetime of good mental function and better overall health. So just how is a solid brain foundation built and maintained in a developing child? One way is through what brain experts call serve and return interactions. Imagine a tennis match between a caregiver and a child, but instead of hitting a ball back and forth across a net, various forms of communication pass between the two. From eye contact to touch, from singing to simple games like peekaboo. These interactions, repeated throughout a young person's developing years, are the bricks that build a healthy foundation for all future development. But another kind of childhood experience shapes brain development too, and that's stress. Good kinds of stress, like meeting new people or studying for a test, are healthy for development because they prepare kids to cope with future challenges. Another kind of stress, called toxic stress, is bad for brain development. If a child is exposed to serious, ongoing hardships like abuse and neglect, and he has no other caregiver in his life to provide support, the basic structures of his developing brain may be damaged. Without a sturdy foundation to properly support future development, he is at risk for a lifetime of health problems, development issues, even addiction. It's possible to fix some of the damage of toxic stress later on, but it's easier, more effective, and less expensive to build solid brain architecture in the first place. One of the things that sturdy brain architecture supports is the development of basic emotional and social skills, an important group of skills which scientists call executive function and self-regulation can be thought of like air traffic control in the child's mental airspace. Think of a young child's brain as the control tower at a busy airport. All those planes landing and taking off and all of the support systems on the ground simultaneously demand the controller's attention to avoid a crash. It's the same with a young child learning to pay attention, plan ahead and remember, and follow lots of rules. Like all of us, kids have to react to things happening in the world around them, while also dealing with worries, temptations, and obligations on their minds. As these demands for attention pile up, air traffic control helps a child regulate the flow of information, prioritize tasks, and above all, find ways to manage stress and avoid mental collisions along the way. Having this ability is a necessity for positive and level mental health. Developing effective air traffic control, overcoming toxic stress, and building solid brain architecture are things kids can't do on their own. And since strong societies are made up of healthy, contributing individuals, it's up to us as a community to make sure all young people have the kinds of nurturing experiences they need for positive development. To build better futures, we need to build better brains.
So we just watched this video about how our brains can develop based on our experiences. And we are looking at this timeline that is showing two different experiences of the world. One thing I'd like you to remember about this image is that we are looking at two different extreme pathways, but that both of these pathways are perfectly adapted to their environment. We all know that every person's life is unique. And for this illustration, we're going to imagine two worlds. One is a mean and dangerous world, and the second one is this kind and generous world. Well, traumatic experience during development, things like abuse, neglect, chaotic relationships, these generate predictable patterns of our brain architecture, behavior, and traits, just like we saw in that video. What's interesting is that our bodies are made to be under stress for only 20 minutes at a time, and that's long enough for us to do that fight, flight, or freeze. So experiences that cause stress chemicals to be constantly produced in the body, for example, something like abuse or neglect, or even living in a war zone, have a huge impact on brain development. Under these type of circumstances, our bodies tend to prepare for life in a constant, dangerous world. And they actually sculpt our brains to be wired for certain characteristics. Things like being edgy or hot-tempered, impulsive, hypervigilant, even being withdrawn, disassociated, or numb. So these certain characteristics we would associate with this path line that we see above, this orange path line of this young man with his hands on his head. We can imagine him living in a world that's mean and dangerous. Maybe he doesn't know where his next meal is coming from. Maybe there is a parent in his home who's dealing with an alcohol dependency, or maybe there's been divorce or separation, or maybe some emotional abuse. And as a result, he may have some adaptations that make his adult functioning have characteristics like being on a very short fuse, or someone who's very self-focused. He may have a difficult time shifting gears from emotion to problem solving. He will be adapting to be ready for whatever the next danger is in his world. And so when we think about these people, we think about, why are they like this, right? Why are they having these behaviors that we consider an inconvenience or difficult to manage or handle? But what this helps us do is shift from, why are you like this, to what happened? Because he has adapted perfectly fine to this environment that is constantly pumping out these stress hormones in his body, making him survive those worst conditions. The thing to remember is that we consider this toxic stress. When stress hormones like cortisol are pumped through our body consistently or hang around for a long time, they are actually toxic to our brain cells. This toxicity actually makes it difficult for our brains to develop in a healthy manner and develop those strong neural networks. And it can also cause our brain cells to die, which is why we call it toxic stress. Now remember, toxic stress is not the normal stress that we can all handle every once in a while in our lives. This is continuous stress, trauma, or episodic unpredictable stress. So there's that difference that we really want to make clear between toxic stress and healthy stress. Moving on to this blue pathway down below, we're going to call this the benevolent world. This world is kind, it is easygoing. This child is free from that toxic traumatic stress. They can understand people, processes, and possibility. They are more likely to develop a brain with cells and wiring that has that healthy neural network. And they are able to be focused, flexible, and they are more relationship oriented. They have adapted perfectly fine to their environment, and they are also able to adapt to that normal, healthy amount of stress. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice a bit. We run into trouble when adaptations, like we just saw in those two different pathways, run into or collide with our societal expectations, because our biology is always going to win. There can be a disconnect between what we are conditioned for based on our environment and what the world expects of us. So think about a teacher who maybe has a student who has trouble sitting down in class, and they are constantly disrupting the classroom. And that teacher might be getting very frustrated with that student. This information helps that teacher be able to shift from being frustrated with their student to equipping their student with skills to be able to function in their environment or their expectations. We often think about the reverse of that. We think about an average person going to be a police officer or a firefighter or going into combat. We send them to boot camp and we equip them with skills and resources to be able to survive in that condition. And that seems normal to us, to give folks resources and tools to survive in a condition that might be dangerous. We don't think about the reverse. When we have someone who grew up on that mean and dangerous pathway, who is constantly at the ready, to then be able to succeed in our societal expectations. So this really, again, helps us shift from what happened to you and why am I having to deal with these behaviors to what was your environment like and how can we help you succeed in our expectations. And we have this new science, which is called epigenetics. And it's really new, and it tells us that experience can actually be passed on to a child from the moment of conception. We all know that we have chromosomes, which is our DNA that's tightly packed and wound together. And what we're learning is that our DNA, even though it doesn't change by inheritance, what can be changed by inheritance is the way that our DNA is expressed. So whether or not that DNA or that gene can be turned on or turned off or used and instructed in a different way. And that's through these chemical tags, which can be modified by experience. And those can be passed on from generation to generation. And what impacts those genes being turned on or off are positive and negative experiences that can impact the genetic expression, therefore transmuting or translating that from parent to child, from generation to generation. So this epigenetics piece is fairly new, and we're really excited to get more data around it. Now, if you remember one thing about this information from brain development that we just talked about, I hope it will be that toxic stress can be hardwired into our biology, and our biology is always going to win.
Okay, so we've been talking a lot, and Lauren's been, well, we haven't been talking a lot. Lauren's been talking about the impact of stress on individuals. So we're going to switch gears just a little bit and talk about the impact that stress, toxic stress in particular, has on a population as a whole. And the field that we'll turn to is epidemiology. So epidemiologists are scientists who study the origins of disease, disability, productivity, and health in a population. So they help us to really focus our efforts on issues and processes that will make the most difference for the well-being of everyone. All right, so before moving on, I wanted to let folks see some examples of the questions that were asked in that original ACE study. So I'm going to give you just a moment to look over some of these questions, and I would love if anybody has any initial thoughts, if you could type them in the chat box. If not, we'll move on, but I'm going to give you just a moment.
And there was just a question about if this presentation will be available afterwards. Courtney, could you share a little bit about that?
Oh, thanks. Yes, so this presentation is actually being recorded, and you would be able to access it on the schoolbehavioralhealth.org website. That's schoolbehavioralhealth.org, and it'll be under the Basque tab. So all of the webinars that have happened in this series are going to be available for folks to access, and it's also being recorded on Facebook Live. So if you follow the School Behavioral Health community, you'll be able to access them that way. And just to give a little bit more context about these questions, and as a reminder, not the question that was just asked, but these survey questions. So these were asked of the participants in that original study, and they're asking adults about things that happened in their childhood. And so that's just something to consider when you're reading them. Obviously, these are not questions, well, not obviously, but they're not questions that were asked to children about their current experiences, but people reflecting on their past experiences. I think I may have seen another question pop up. Let me just see. Oh, that was just the person responding saying thank you. No problem. Okay. So any other thoughts about these questions or any just initial reactions? I will make the point that South Carolina in particular, as well as other states, have added, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in a second, but they have added additional questions because we're continuing to gather this data. And so some states have opted to add questions that they want data or information on. So for South Carolina, we've added 8 additional questions that have asked more pointed things about homelessness, your parents' graduation, whether they graduated from high school, things like that, to gather more in-depth information. And so one thing that I think is important to note for this ACE study is that prior to this, most studies really focused on a single type of adversity, such as sexual abuse or physical abuse. This was really the first study of its kind that looked at multiple forms of childhood stressors and the impacts that those stressors have on children and adults as they grow older. So some interesting things about the population that was included in the original study. Like I said, it was over 17,000 adults, but some things that are interesting to take note of is that the participants were generally well educated. Most of them had attended college, and only about 6% did not have a high school diploma, as compared with 13% of the general US population. The ages ranged anywhere from 19 to 94 years old, and they were predominantly white middle-class people that had access to some of the best healthcare in the world. So you can kind of see how this doesn't necessarily generalize to the larger population, and you can maybe think of some populations that you work with that this, I mean, in no way relates to, you know, the folks that you work with. So we're gonna, in a moment, provide some data on South Carolina specifically, but I also, we're gonna provide some information on where folks from other states could gather some information about ACE data that's been collected in their home state. All right, so this slide here is showing, first off, how common ACEs are, but also it's breaking down the different categories of ACEs. And so the first group of indicators are household dysfunction indicators. So things such as growing up with substance abuse, substance abusing household members, parental separation or divorce, so on and so forth. The next being neglect, both emotional and physical neglect. And the third category being emotional, physical, and sexual abuse. And so as you can see from the percentages on the slide, ACEs are very common. And again, we have to remember that this is data that was gathered with that 17,000 participants that, you know, are generally middle class, well educated. people. So again, you know, you could just take a moment to look at some of those percentages and see the high rate of ACEs. So, you know, 27% of the participants indicated that there were substance issues in their home, or 28% reporting that there was physical abuse that happened in their home. And we'll move on from here. And because adverse childhood experiences are so highly interrelated, it really doesn't make sense to look at how single categories of ACEs influence health and social problems. So what was decided is that there would be an ACE score. So the score is simply just a count of the number of categories of ACEs that each person reported from 0 to 10. So each category counts as 1 point in the ACE score. So it's not necessarily how many times a person experienced a certain situation, but just simply whether or not it occurred. So for example, if a person experienced physical abuse, no matter how many times or what the severity of the abuse was, the ACE score is 1. If the person experienced physical abuse and had a substance abusing parent, the ACE score would be 2, so on and so forth. So you can kind of think of the ACE score as a measure of the childhood biological stress dose. As the ACE score goes up, on average, the exposure to developmental effects of toxic stress also increases. All right, so people who report higher ACEs are more likely to have health and social problems. And this graph here is demonstrating that as an ACE score goes up, the percentage of people with health and social problems also goes up. So we call this the dose-response relationship. You can kind of think of it as, you know, the more gas you put in your car, the further you'll be able to go. So the more ACEs you have, the more likely you are to have some sort of health problems. And we have tons and tons of these sorts of slides that show the correlation between ACE score and some sort of negative outcome. And so I'm going to move on through just a couple of examples. So this graph is showing you two different things. It's showing you that it's showing you basically how you can anticipate why ACEs are related to certain behaviors and social conditions. So here we see the risk of having issues with alcohol increases 6 times over from an ACE score of 0 to an ACE score of 4 or more. And it's also showing you that ACEs affect relationships. So people with higher ACE scores are more likely to marry a person who has issues with alcohol. So you can then, you know, going back to what Lauren was talking about epigenetics and kind of, you can start to think about how this can then become an intergenerational issue and how this can be passed on from child to adult to child to adult. This is another example of how ACEs and depression are related. So you can see here for both men and women, the more ACEs you experience, the more likely you are to experience depression as an adult. And I think this slide, along with a slide that's going to be coming up here next, really drives home some of the things that we've been talking about. So this slide is a list of some of the health and social problems that have been documented by ACE study publications. So the ACE researchers concluded that ACEs are the leading cause of health and social problems in our nation. And, you know, you might look at this list and wonder how on earth are ACEs in any way connected to, you know, down the line having liver disease. But this is what the research has found, that these are some of the problems that adults experience secondary to having ACEs as children. And should really lead us to the road of prevention. You know, if you are working with someone or working with a child or even working with an adult, knowing that they have a high ACE score, you know, you might recommend that they have more regular doctor visits or things of that nature, have more, you know, maybe referring them to a counselor, or, you know, just kind of being more proactive and thinking about that preventative piece. This is another one of the slides that really helps drive home the message. So what you're looking at here, this slide shows the shows the percentage of various health and social outcomes that epidemiologists estimate are caused by ACEs. So the percentage of a problem coded by that oil spill that you see there represents the percentage of each problem that is potentially preventable by preventing ACEs. I'm curious if anyone has any thoughts or comments. Okay.
So this map shows us that over the past 8 years, you can see the number of states collecting ACEs data increase significantly. So from 2009, you can see there's only a couple states who are collecting ACEs data. And as the years have progressed, we can see all of them kind of trickling in at different times, which is amazing. And approximately 35 states have collected data in some capacity since the original ACE study. You can see in the Southeast, there's a good number of us who are collecting data, and in South Carolina specifically, we've been collecting our ACEs data through our initiative since 2014. Next up, we're going to briefly look into some of our South Carolina ACEs data, and I'm hoping that some of you will find this applicable to your work. But for more information on nationwide data or state-specific data, you can visit aceconnection.com, and I have actually entered that into the chat for you right now if you want to save that for later. But we're going to look at just some specific South Carolina ACE data. In South Carolina, what we do around ACEs is through our ACE initiative, which focuses on a few key activities. The first being that ACE data collection I just mentioned and the dissemination of that data. Our ACE interface master training. So we are training folks on ACEs who can then deliver trainings or webinars like this one today on ACEs, what that data tells us, and some of that brain development work, as well as the pieces around resilience. It also involves our South Carolina prevention framework and also introducing ACE legislative policies. The way that we collect our data in South Carolina is through the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System, or what we like to call the BRFIS. This surveillance system, or this survey, is representative of South Carolina's adult population. It is a phone-based survey. It is something that is conducted in all 50 states. However, not all 50 states may be asking the ACEs questions on this specific survey. The other thing to remember is these are non-incarcerated adults over the age of 18 who are eligible to answer this survey. So again, we are asking adults to think back on their life, so they are retrospectively looking back on their childhood and answering questions about this. What our South Carolina ACE data shows us is that 3 in 5 South Carolinians report experiencing ACEs. And of those South Carolinians who report ACEs, 25% report only one ACE. 14% report 2 ACEs, 9% report 3 ACEs, and 12% of those reporting ACEs are 4 or more. What I'd like to note is that the reason why we don't break out 4, 5, or 6 or more ACEs is because once we get to someone experiencing 4 ACEs, their health and social outcomes don't differ that much from 4 and beyond. So as your ACE score increases, so does the risk of disease, social, and emotional problems. With an ACE score of 4 or more, things start getting serious, like the likelihood of pulmonary lung disease increases by 390%, the likelihood of contracting hepatitis is 240%, or experiencing depression increases 460%. And suicide actually increases about 1,200% with 4 or more ACEs. So those are pretty staggering numbers when we think about them.
And here are just some other general notes about the odds of experiencing other abuse once you've experienced a certain type of abuse. So to more clearly state that, if a child has experienced physical abuse, they're at 17 times greater odds to have also experienced emotional abuse, or 11 times greater odds to have household domestic violence. So the reason that we're sharing these sorts of statistics are, again, to just create awareness and try to move towards that preventative model of, you know, if you know a child who has experienced physical abuse, just be on the lookout for other indicators of other types of abuse and making sure that you're reporting that as you are mandatory reporters, if you are a mandatory reporter. Here's another slide about household substance abuse and the greater odds of experiencing these other sorts of abuse or household issues.
These odds ratios help us look at the prevalence of ACEs and how interrelated they really are.
Yes, exactly. And that helps me move into this next slide here, that just kind of a take-home point, that ACEs are common, they're interrelated, and they are powerful. So people with higher ACE scores are more likely to have multiple health and social problems, as I mentioned earlier, and as we've kind of mentioned throughout, so some of which increase the odds of their children having high ACE scores.
What we want to remember, though, is that what is predictable is preventable. And we've seen through this data that ACEs are predictable, so that means that they are also preventable. And while our ACEs work hasn't given us this clear roadmap yet, there are lots of things that each of us can do to shift the way that our culture deals with ACEs and how we can begin to prevent them. The things that we have learned so far are these core protective systems based on resilience. We know that everyone gets excited by this notion of resilience, partly because it reminds us that our supportive actions matter, and it gives us this sense of hope, and it helps us be able to search for more ways to support and help families and our communities. So resilience is built in 3 ways. The first being individual capabilities, the second one being attachment and belonging, and the third one, having caring and competent, that's the second one, having caring and competent relationships with one another, that attachment and belonging, and the third one being tapping into our community, whether it's our faith communities, our school communities, our neighborhood communities, and really tapping into our spirituality or our faith-based and cultural processes. What we know is that the 3 protective systems are nested, and that people do best when they are living in thriving families and communities. And so building those can really help us begin to prevent ACEs, and also to help those of us who have experienced ACEs be able to rise up in the face of adversity. So looking at our individual capabilities, they give us hope. The first part of having an individual competency is having a positive view about ourselves. It lets us know that we are important, that we are valuable. It helps us ask for help when we need it. It is the story that we tell ourselves, right? That good things can happen to me. When we notice the core gifts of each person and help them find opportunities to give those gifts to a community that they care about, we are helping generate a positive view and hope. And they are more people who have that positive view and hope. They are more likely to complete at least more than 1 year of post-high school education. They're less likely to be depressed. They're more likely to be employed. Even in a recession, they're more likely to be employed. The second part of our individual capabilities is having self-efficacy. And that's the belief that what I do influence what happens to me, right? The choices that I make matter. Simple things that we can all do to build self-efficacy are things like asking people to do tasks or chores that have a real value for your family or your community, encouraging a person to build skills that are complex and that might take some time to develop. The third piece of our individual capabilities is self-regulation. And this is a big one, especially for our young people. It's our ability to gauge our state of mind and our emotions and to be able to keep these under control when we're navigating different social situations. So there are a number of ways to practice self-regulation. They might include things like deep breathing, mindfulness, maybe prayers, something for somebody, or movement, other calming practices to help bring us back to a moment so we can adapt to the situation that we need. The second core protective system in building resilience is attachment and belonging. One of my favorite speakers and authors, Dr. Brené Brown, says that we are hardwired for love and belonging. And that's what this piece really speaks to. We want to make sure that not just children, but adults have relationships with caring and competent people, because those are vital contributors to resilience and recovery. We also want to make sure that it's not just having relationships with people that care about us, but that competency requires learning new skills and practicing safety in all of its forms when relating to people who are hardwired for survival in a dangerous and unpredictable world. So that competent piece is really important when we're talking about this ACEs work, because I can care for you, but that doesn't mean that I may be giving you the best advice or the best support for you at that time in your life. The next thing in our core competencies for building resilience is our cultural processes, or tapping into our communities. We know that to dramatically improve health and safety for this generation and for future generations, we must foster thriving communities. And that's about empowerment. It's about investing in the people who have the most at stake so they can be their expert leaders in their own communities' change. We want to make sure that people feel empowered in their communities to lift each other up, to speak their truth, to use their voice, and to take action. And so in every community that you are a part of, it's important that you are really working to help foster these thriving communities. And it's really important to remember that we know that this doesn't happen overnight, but that it happens in the way that we relate to one another on an individual basis. Transformational change is not this magic wand and all of a sudden everything's different. It is really shaped by our thoughts, our conversations, and the way that we relate to one another in our relationships, in our families, in our communities, and how we really walk through the world in our day-to-day. So with that, change is really up to us. It's really up to the individual as we work on building out more of these structures to build thriving communities through the work that we do.
All right, so that is the end of the presentation. I just want to, as a last point, really point out that we're not here, we're not all here to bring scores ACE scores necessarily down to 0, but we're just here to make a change. And as Lauren just mentioned in that last slide, the change is really up to us. And being that one person that a child can rely on and count on, can make a huge impact in their life. I do want to, I'm going to switch to this slide here. I just want to point out, so I mentioned earlier, and I'll type it here in the message box, schoolbehavioralhealth.org is where you will be able to access these webinars at a later date. They've been recorded. And also, we have a annual conference, the Southeastern School Behavioral Health Conference. I think this is our 5th or 6th year. That'll be coming up in 2019. It's a great opportunity to bring together folks who care about school mental health from all across the Southeast. And really encourage folks to visit that website and register, where we've grown. I think this last year was over 550 attendees, and we're just looking to continue to grow this even larger. Thank you, Tanya. If anybody else has any other questions, we still have a few minutes. We're happy to stick around and answer some questions as they come up. I don't know if you want to share your video, Lauren.
Oh, are you back on? Okay, yes.
Put a face back with the voices.
There we go.
I'll just pull up the chat. Where did it go? Okay. Any questions? No pressure. So someone asked if there are any notes available online. There's tons of information available on ACEs online. The aceconnection.com is a great resource. Also, I'd really encourage folks to check out Children's Trust of South Carolina, scchildren.org. Is that right? scchildren.org.
Yes.
Yeah. It's a phenomenal resource, and there's a lot of work that goes into providing various resources. There's also resources on the schoolbehavioralhealth.org website, not just about ACEs, but about other resources that are available. So I would encourage you to check those out, Melanie.
And I'm going to just post the link to the ACEs page on the Children's Trust website for you guys.
Awesome.
There's a couple of cool printables that you can get from there that kind of sum up what we showed today. While we can't actually send out any of the presentation, Courtney said it will be available as a recording, but the actual slides we're not allowed to share, unfortunately.
Thank you for that. Got a request to put up some of the resources on the School Behavioral Health website, so we'll make sure to do that.
And we can also post some videos like the brain builders that we had. There's a couple other videos that speak to ACEs and resilience. There's a lot of really great TED Talks out there as well. So you can, I mean, if you just like Google ACEs, there's a ton of great resources that are out there. But we can definitely share some stuff that we use.
Absolutely. Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris is one of my favorite speakers on the topic. She's amazing. She's a pediatrician that really has built her practice around ACE and ACE-informed practice. So I'd really encourage, she has some great TED Talks and just interviews out there. I would really encourage folks to check her out. Also, again, if you're interested in other resources, the School Behavioral Health website is a great chance to access those. Thanks, June. All right. Yes, I'll put.
I can actually see if I can pull up one of her videos and post a link if that would be helpful.
Oh yeah, that would be great. Her name is Nadine Burke Harris. Thank you, Tanika. Hope I said that right. Awesome. Yeah, that's probably one of my favorite videos that Lauren just posted the link for. So I'd really encourage, I've posted it on our lab's website and or Facebook page, I guess. So please check that out. And like Lauren said, literally, if you go to Google or YouTube and just type in ACEs, you might need to type in adverse childhood experiences. Otherwise, a lot of different things will come up. But there's so many great speakers on the topic.
I also posted her TED Talk because that's different than the longer talk that I posted above.
Oh, gotcha. Perfect.
Actually, that first talk is available on the ACEs connection, which we mentioned before. Okay. So if you want a great hub, that's always a good one.
Awesome. The questions are still slowly trickling in, so I will hang around until 5 o'clock and, you know, until everyone has gotten a chance to ask a question. If you have it. It'd be awesome, June, if you could get Nadine Burke Harris to be a keynote speaker.
Right?
Oh, I see somebody. I guess there's different ways to post questions here. I see someone, Hannah, had asked a question about epigenetics data.
There's a couple of different videos. There's one that we did not show in here because it's a little bit longer. We can definitely add some of that to the resources that we post along with the video. I'll try to find the link to that right now and post it. It's still fairly new in the work that we're doing, so we don't have as robust as a lot of the other brain development stuff, but we do have a good bit. Awesome. So I'll find that now.
Oh, sure. Someone requested that we post the link to the video that we did show, the brain builders.
Okay, I can do that right now as well.
Thank you. You're much better at that than me. I hear it.
Yep.
Robert was asking, how do we get involved with the Southeastern Behavior Alliance? Actually, if you could visit here, we would love folks to get involved. One of the best ways, honestly, to get involved, I probably messed that up, to get involved would be the conference. But let me see. June, are you still around, or Catherine?
I am. I was going to say he can contact me directly.
Okay.
Let me put my, are you on that chat still?
Yep.
I can give you my email address.
Yep.
Widener, WIDENERK @sc.edu.
And June also mentioned that we would love to have ambassadors for the conference. So folks that are interested in kind of spreading the word. Is it at sc.edu? I feel like I made that up as I was typing, Catherine.
No, I have that's right.
That is right. Okay.
Yeah.
I hope that answers your question, Robert.
And Megan, the link that's right below your comment on the video link for the Brain Builders, I didn't label it, but that's that longer Bing video. That's the Brain Builders.
Oh, okay. I was taking a look at that.
And then I did post a short epigenetics video. It's really basic, but I really love the way that he explains it. It's nice and digestible for anybody who wants a little bit more.
Awesome. Well, I see we're at 5:01. Were there any last minute questions? Otherwise, we'll call it a day. I know folks are probably ready to go home. If they're not already at home. I guess that's the nice thing about a webinar. All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining us in this discussion, and thank you for the questions and just remaining engaged. And we really have enjoyed this opportunity. I don't know if you had anything you wanted to say, Lauren.
Nope. We appreciate you sharing your time with us.
All right.
And we hope you learned something.
Yes. All right. Thank you, guys. I'm not sure if that's Cheryl or Catherine that's still on, but I'm wondering if there's anything else that we needed to do.
Hi, this is Cheryl. I was actually able to catch it. No, everything is done. I believe the meeting has officially ended. So thank you so much, guys. It was great.
Awesome. Thank you.
And
Thank
you
you
to
again, Lauren.
Catherine, who's still there. Okay.
All
All right, guys. Have a great evening.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.